Good evening. Before I begin, I want to introduce myself. My name is Rodolfo Lopez. I am from Chihuahua, and I am 34 years old. This story is quite recent, and it is the first time I am sharing it with a larger audience outside of my close circle because every time I tell it, I get a lump in my throat. It is still very difficult for me to digest. I am a truck driver and have been doing this for over 5 years. My routes generally take me along the border with the United States. I know those roads like the back of my hand. I usually take long trips that last up to 4 or 5 days, staying at truck stops to rest. Before I start sharing my story, I want to clarify that I do not use any substances. I do not drink alcohol, and certainly not during my trips. The only thing I might say I am addicted to is junk food, unfortunately. But anyway, I will start telling you what happened to me that early morning. I was on a long trip, wide awake since I had just left a truck stop where I had slept very well. It was around 2 or 3 in the morning, and I was driving through a mountainous area with many curves. I was going very slowly and focused on the road, as I have a wife and 2 children waiting for me at home. I always remember that long before reaching a sharp curve, suddenly someone crossed in front of me. But what left me most shocked was that the person who crossed in front of me was my younger brother. He had passed away years ago from an illness. He was 18 years old when he died. I knew it was him instantly. He was wearing his soccer uniform, the one we had buried him in. My only reaction was to brake almost abruptly. I was very agitated and scared, looking around to see where my brother had gone, but I couldn't see him anymore. He was nowhere to be found, but I stayed there, static, unable to understand what the hell had happened. Meanwhile, a truck approaching from behind honked at me and overtook me, yelling some profanities. I took a deep breath and tried to calm down so I could continue driving, as the shock I had experienced was immense. I regained my composure and started moving slowly, approaching that curve little by little. But before I reached it, I suddenly saw a truck coming from the opposite direction collide head-on with the truck that had overtaken me. The truck that overtook me fell into a not very deep ravine, but the driver lost his life instantly. I had witnessed 2 shocking events in less than 5 minutes. I couldn't stop trembling. I immediately called emergency services, and in the meantime, I put on my hazard lights to warn other vehicles to slow down as they approached the chaotic scene. By a miracle, the driver of the truck coming from the opposite direction survived, although he was badly injured. The guy was drunk and was, of course, arrested after being treated at the hospital. I left the scene, but my mind couldn't stop processing everything that had happened in those 5 minutes, wondering if my brother had appeared to me because he knew what was going to happen and wanted to save my life. I felt, and still feel to this day, that this is why he manifested himself. He wanted to save me, although sadly, another person suffered that fate and lost their life. It is hard to explain how I felt. I had many mixed emotions. I felt guilty because it should have been me who crashed into that truck. And I also felt fear but gratitude towards my deceased brother, because I knew his intentions were to protect me. However, I always felt that my destiny had been altered. I don't know, but it was something very difficult to process. I thank you for taking the time to listen to my experience. I do this with all due respect to the victim of that fatal accident, and I continue to pray for him and his family. Hello, my name is Juan Carlos and I am a truck driver. I am from Mexico City, but I travel to various places throughout the Mexican Republic, transporting raw materials. I have been in this business for years because my father, rest in peace, dedicated his entire life to this profession, and since I was a child I loved trucks. I always wanted to be like him. Now I see that it is not an easy job, especially in these times when the roads have become even more dangerous, particularly in certain states of the Republic where I have had several scares, not necessarily paranormal ones. Honestly, given the current situation, I dare say I would prefer to encounter paranormal events rather than become a victim of crime. But be careful what you wish for. This story is of a paranormal nature. It was the first and only time I experienced something like this, and it was very impactful. One night during one of my trips through the Republic, I was leaving one of those roadside restaurants. It was past 10 p.m. when I exited the place, heading to make my delivery, with about 9 hours of travel left. I was talking to a friend on my phone speaker. He had just had problems with his wife and was telling me the whole situation. Not to sound mean, but it helped keep me entertained and awake. That's why I always like talking to someone or listening to music while driving. I was crossing a road notorious for its crime. I was a bit nervous since it had only been a month since one of my colleagues was robbed on the same route. But talking to my friend calmed me down a lot. Suddenly, something caught my attention. "Hold on, I see people in the woods," I told my friend on the phone. "What do you mean, people?" "You're joking, right?" he replied, laughing mockingly. I stopped responding for a few seconds, slowing down to get a better look. Indeed, there were many people, men and women, standing in the woods on the right side of the road. "What happened, Juan?" my friend asked repeatedly, sounding worried. I told him that he wouldn't believe it, but there were many people standing and watching me. He warned me to get out of there quickly, as it could be a trap to rob me. So, I took his advice and left. It was something very disturbing. Neither my friend nor I knew what was happening. Later he made fun of me, saying I must have been hallucinating, and that's why I saw people in the woods. But I was genuinely scared. Although after a few hours, I forgot about it. Sometime later, I made the delivery. It took a few hours to unload the truck, and then I slept in the cab almost all day to recover for the return trip. Around 8 p.m., I hit the road back to my city. The entire journey was normal, quiet, nothing out of the ordinary. It was already early morning when I was about to pass that place again. I remembered exactly where it had happened, as I had memorized the kilometer marker. This time, I wasn't talking to anyone, which made it doubly creepy. And I saw them again. They were the same people, still standing in the same positions as the previous night, all watching me pass by without doing anything, without moving. This time I didn't stop. I passed by at the same speed I was going, but I saw them clearly. It was too late to call my friend and tell him, so I waited until dawn, as he woke up at 6 a.m. for work. When the time came, I called and told him that I had seen those people again in the same position as the night before. He was just as confused as I was and asked me what kilometer marker it was and what road. I gave him the number and the name, and he said he would call me back in a few minutes. About 5 minutes later, he called me. He said he had searched the exact location on the internet, and the first thing that came up was news about mass graves found there. Most of the bodies were migrants, and this had happened just a few months ago. My skin crawled. I cursed at my friend, telling him not to joke about this, but he assured me he wouldn't make something like that up. He told me to check for myself when I got home. Everything was online, including photos. The first thing I did when I got home was check, and everything my friend had said was true. I didn't want to see the photos, but I read several articles talking about the same thing. There were over 50 bodies piled up. It was very sad for me to read that. I couldn't stop thinking if the people I had seen were them, or rather their souls, unable to move on. To this day, it's hard for me to tell this story. Many people don't believe me, but sadly it's something I experienced and I don't understand why they manifested to me, or maybe others who passed by also saw them. I don't know. Thank you all for listening to my story. Have a good evening. I would like to share an anecdote with you that happened to me some time ago. It was something that had a significant impact on me, and I am still very much affected by it. My name is Patricio Garza, I am from Chiapas, Mexico, and I am a truck driver. I am 45 years old and have spent half of my life doing this job because I enjoy it a lot. Over the years, I have made many friends in this line of work. Many of my colleagues have become close to me. I know their families, and they know mine. So, after this brief introduction, I will begin to share the paranormal experience that happened to me. One night while I was working on the road, I decided to stop at a place where truckers are allowed to park and rest. There are also bathrooms and a small restaurant there. I often run into many of my friends and colleagues at this spot, and it's always nice to spend some time with them while we eat or have dinner. So, I arrived at the place and parked. I was walking through the parking lot to get to the restaurant and bathroom when suddenly I saw a woman standing between two parked trucks. As I looked closer, I noticed it was the wife of one of my colleagues, someone I hadn't seen in a long time and knew nothing about. I was glad to see her. I approached her with a smile and greeted her, but she did not return the greeting or smile back. I told her that I was Patricio, her husband's friend and colleague, and that we had met at a certain party. I thought maybe she didn't remember me and that's why she didn't respond. But she didn't say a word. I noticed she seemed very strange. I asked if she was waiting for her husband and she nodded. So, I told her I was heading to where he was and would let him know she was waiting for him. After that, I hurried to the restaurant, and before going to the bathroom, I looked for my colleague among all the truckers there. Finally, I found him as he was coming out of the bathroom. I greeted him warmly since it had been a long time since we last saw each other. He had stopped working for a while, but we never knew why. After our greetings and hugs, I told him that his wife was outside his truck waiting for him. I mentioned that she didn't recognize me when I greeted her, but I told her I would let him know she was waiting. His reaction was very unsettling for me. His smile disappeared, his eyes filled with tears, and he said, "It can't be." I saw him take out his phone, his hands trembling as he dialed a number. Meanwhile, I stayed with him, unsure of what was happening. When someone answered, he started crying and repeatedly saying, "No," in a broken voice. Many colleagues came over to see what was happening, hugging him and asking what was going on. Finally, he managed to tell us through his tears and choked voice that his wife had terminal cancer, and he had just been notified that she had passed away. I was in shock. I couldn't even hug him. My legs were trembling. Everyone was hugging him and trying to console him, but no one had seen his wife outside his truck just a few minutes ago. I don't remember exactly how it happened, but I was still in shock when suddenly he stood up from the floor and started asking me where I had seen her, where I had seen his wife. I just broke down crying because I didn't want to add to his pain. I realized that the woman I saw was indeed her, and maybe she had wanted to say goodbye to him. He kept asking where she was, and I told him outside his truck, but that maybe I was mistaken, that it might not have been her, and he shouldn't pay attention to me. But he ran outside anyway. 2 colleagues and I ran after him, but when he got to his truck, no one was there. His wife was no longer there. I just gave him a strong hug while he cried uncontrollably. A colleague offered to drive him home in his truck because he was in no condition to drive. My truck was empty since I had already made my delivery, so I offered to take over his delivery for the next day. We transferred the items to my truck, and I drove off with tears in my eyes. It was a deeply impactful experience. His great love had come to say goodbye to him, but I still don't understand why I was the one who saw her and not him, her husband. Hello everyone, I am a truck driver, and tonight I want to share my story with you. I considered myself one of the few who had never experienced anything paranormal on the road, aside from some scares by criminal gangs, but nothing inexplicable. I even had a hard time believing the stories some of my colleagues told. That's how skeptical I was. I had never seen anything strange or paranormal, but as they say never. That night, during my usual route, it was past midnight as I drove along this road I travel every week. I was listening to music and eating some snacks. Everything was calm, nothing out of the ordinary. But suddenly in the distance I noticed someone walking along the side of the road. I slowed down a bit, as we were practically surrounded by wilderness, and it was still about 2 hours to the next city. These roads are very dangerous, inhabited by some criminal gangs. It is not safe to drive there at night, let alone walk, especially if you're a woman. As I got closer, I realized it was a woman, a young woman in fact, walking in a torn dress with loose and disheveled hair. I stopped to offer her help. I didn't want to make her uncomfortable or scared, but I couldn't leave her there alone. As I mentioned, it was a very dangerous road, and if I didn't help her, someone else might take her. I stopped next to her and asked if she was okay. She stopped walking, turned to look at me with a lost look in her eyes, and I noticed she had bruises on her face. She didn't respond. I thought maybe she had been kidnapped and just released or had escaped. So I told her to get in the truck quickly, fearing someone might be following her to harm her. She didn't think twice and got in, sitting in the passenger seat. I honestly didn't know what to do. If I called the police, they might end up handing her back to her captors. Those who live in Mexico will understand. You never know who is good or bad. I just wanted to take her to her family. So I asked her several times where she lived, what her name was, and if she knew any family member's phone number. But to all these questions, she just looked at me without responding. She seemed to be in shock, or so I deduced. I decided to take her to the next city to get her to a hospital for a checkup. I didn't know what else to do for her since I knew nothing about the girl. I even called my wife to tell her what was happening. The first thing she told me was to make sure no one was following me, fearing that helping her might put me in danger too. But I told her no, that no one was following me, as I was checking all the time. My wife is a witness to what happened that night, and it's good, I thought, to call her to keep her updated. The whole way, the young woman didn't speak. She kept her arms on her legs and just stared ahead with a lost look. She didn't seem aware of herself. I offered her the little food I had, but she didn't want it, or rather didn't respond at all. She seemed traumatized or something like that. But anyway, before we reached the city, she suddenly opened the truck door. I stopped immediately, as she could fall and get hurt. But as soon as I stopped, she got out and ran into the wilderness, and I couldn't find her anymore. Everything was very strange. I didn't know what to do. I did look for her, but it was as if she had vanished among the branches. I couldn't find her again. I called my wife and asked her what I should do, if I should call the police to inform them. But she told me no, as they could be in on it and might blame me for what had happened to the girl. So I just left, praying that someone else with a good heart would find and help her. I finished that trip, and about 3 days later, I was at home resting, wasting time on social media, when I suddenly saw that a news page had shared a search bulletin for that woman. All the characteristics matched. There was no doubt it was her. The post was from 5 days ago, exactly the day I found her on the road. But it said she had been missing for more than 2 weeks since her family last saw her. Without thinking twice, I contacted her mother. I called the phone number she had left for information about her daughter. She was from a state far away from where I found her. I live in the north of the country and she was from the south. Nervously, I told her everything I just told you, and that the last time I saw her, she had run into the wilderness at such and such a kilometer. But the lady told me I must have been mistaken, that it couldn't be her daughter because 2 days ago they had called her to deliver her remains. According to the forensic experts, she had been killed the same day she was taken. I couldn't believe it, as just a few days ago I had seen her, and she had disappeared 2 weeks ago, the same 2 weeks the forensic experts said she had been dead. I respectfully told the lady that I was sure it was her. She had a very distinctive mark, a noticeable mole on her left leg. The girl I picked up also had it, but the lady insisted it couldn't be her, as they had already done the tests to identify her, and the results were positive. The blood matched the lady's. It was her daughter. She tearfully told me they had found her in an abandoned truck in the wilderness, where there were more women's bodies. But she couldn't talk as she was threatened. She asked me not to speak about the matter with anyone else and thanked me for calling, but insisted until the end that it couldn't have been her daughter who got into my truck. After I hung up, I broke down crying. My wife was there with me and heard everything on speakerphone. She hugged me without saying anything, and also shed some tears. I kept telling her repeatedly that it was her while my wife said she trusted me. It made me very sad what happened to that young woman, and now I don't know if it was her soul wandering in that wilderness, if I had a ghost as a passenger the whole time. Although I find it hard to believe, every Sunday when my wife and I go to church, we light a candle for her and pray for her soul. I just hope she's in a better place now, resting in peace. Good night.